Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Frankie Flores. I am the director of the LGBTQ Resource Center at UNM. Thank you for joining us for our kickoff for our TDOR events, 2020 TDOR Transgender Day Remembrance, honoring trans lives and celebrating trans resistance. We were very intentional that we wanted to not just focus on those that we've lost, but also honor those who are still fighting and really honor the progression, right, that we are trying to encapsulate. You know, we don't want to just talk about trans people in a negative or in, you know, in mourning, right? Let's also talk about trans people as they're living. And so we wanted to start it off today with a panel and discussion really about trans history and the trans movement. So it's informal, but it's also, I think, very exciting. I think that that's kind of the best way to do it. You know, I'm not a big fan of us being very like linear. We are not linear people, which I actually think is kind of a blessing of being queer. Like we can think in a multitude of ways. I do want to introduce my co-panelists. They are both graduate students at the University of New Mexico at the LGBTQ Resource Center. You know, students really are the backbone of the center, and these two students really exemplify that. So I will let you both introduce yourselves. And we'll start with Biko, because I know y'all are just going to sit there awkwardly.
Hi, everybody. My name is Biko Villa. My pronouns are they or AX. I'm a master's student with the Chicanic Studies Department, and my focus is on queer Chicanics Marxist feminism. And I'm also a graduate assistant at the UNM LGBTQ Resource Center, where I focus on providing BIPOC resources to students, staff, and faculty.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lazarus Letcher, or Laz. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a PhD student in American Studies. My master's thesis was on Trans Day of Remembrance, so it's nice to practice what I preach a bit. And my current research focuses on Black transgender history and Black and Indigenous collaborations for liberation. And at the LGBTQ Resource Center, I run our transgender peer support group, Transformations.
Thank you both. For the attendees that we have, we do have a Q&A option. If you want to shoot us any questions, feel free to do so. I also want to give a shout out real quick to our amazing admin assistant, Joanna, who is helping behind the scenes. Thank you so much, Joanna, for helping. I also want to recognize our DEI family that is with us today. So we have Dr. Asada Zarai, who is our Vice President of the Division of Equity and Inclusion. We also have Liz Hutchinson, who is Assistant Vice President, sorry, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Assistant Vice President for the Division of Equity and Inclusion. We also have Lorena Blanco Silva, who is Diversity Director at the Division of Equity and Inclusion. We also have Monica and Rodney, who are with the Division of Equity and Inclusion. And we do have a couple of student, staff, and volunteers at the Resource Center as well. We have Alex Baca, who is the co-chair for QSA. And we also have Leah Williams, who is one of our other graduate students at the Resource Center. So I wanted to begin actually with, we've talked about this a lot. I want to begin though with a conversation around anachronisms with trans folks, because I feel like there's this like constant idea of let's just name all these people as trans, when that word didn't exist, right? Like the word transsexual or transvestite is a fairly modern word when we think about like the history of sexuality, right? And the history of like gender identity and expression. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love that question. I just reread Leslie Feinberg's Transgender Warriors, And that was one of the things that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, was going through history and using these terms that folks didn't have and then like labeling them, especially folks who are non-white, because I think it's important to note that like all of these trans rooted words, transvestite, transsexual, transgender, are all created by white folks. And I always wonder, like, before slavery, what terms existed in West Africa that might have fit me better. And like, I use the labels of trans and non-binary because that language is no longer accessible to me. That's an act of genocide. And I think it is important to note that these are modern terms and these are also white terms. But for those of us that don't have anything better, but yeah, I used to give a lot of trans history talks, and I've kind of taken a step back from that, and instead I say people who lived and loved beyond the gender binary, which I think is like gives a little more grace and a little more wiggle room for folks. Like maybe if they had these terms, they might have identified that way, but it feels almost like a disservice to these humans to like label them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Laz on that, in that, a lot of the terms have been created in like a Western hegemonic atmosphere. And I think that we have forgotten a lot of people on the ground who have put in this work, to give more opportunities for people to identify, um, as multiple genders. But I also agree with Laz in that, I identify as non-binary, but to be quite honest, I don't really think it encompasses everything that I feel about my gender. And I feel like if, these really popular terms were created through a more different, like, decolonial framework that encompasses like a lot of like different cultures, then I feel like a lot of us BIPOC folks would have terms that would culture not only like culturally, um fit how we feel gender wise, but it would be extremely like affirming as well. I would probably not identify as non-binary, but something that's a little bit more fitting.
Yeah. I think also it's important to really like place emphasis on the fact that the word transvestite, right, was used as a diagnosis. Like these words that we use are rooted actually in a lot of colonial violence and a lot of medical violence and psychological violence as well. And so it's a struggle, right? And so I think maybe I want to ask a question like, should we consider creating new terms that work better for us? Not all at once.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's happening already. Like, I work with trans youth at a camp, and sometimes they'll tell me how they identify, and I'll slink away and Google it because it's terms I haven't heard before, which is like, it's great that things are evolving and that we're able to get more precise with our language. And that's kind of how I feel about non-binary. Like, it's a newer term, and like these terms that came like in the 90s and early 2000s that were community generated and not placed upon us by these medical gatekeepers, by these cultural kind of norms, but instead were kind of grassroots terms. But like Pico was saying, like I would like more culturally specific terms, and like within the Black community, like we have stud, we have like boys BOI, which is something I identify with. But the thing is too is like when we do have these cultural specific terms, is like white people take them almost immediately as well. Like I think a lot of folks don't know those terms have these roots in these communities. Same thing with like two spirit. Like if you're not native, you're not two spirit, honey. So even if we do have these culturally specific terms, like culture vultures will still snag them.
Yeah, and I think I want to actually spend a moment on the word two spirit. I'm sorry, Biko, did you have anything to add to that?
Oh yeah, so my parents speak English, but I had grandparents who didn't speak English, and I know folks within the Latinx community or just like other communities who their first language isn't English. Coming out to family, sometimes it's a little hard because they don't really understand what queer means or what trans means because it's used more in like a certain context where only English speakers can really understand them. So I think, yeah, I think it's important to start creating different cultural terms, especially for those who don't speak English or aren't really like acculturated into like this sort of culture who like uses those terms.
Yeah. And that actually that does go into what I want to talk about with Two Spirit, right? Because there's this, I think, really problematic notion, and I think it's a big notion amongst non-Indigenous folks of the concept of Two Spirit, right? And this like concept of like sacredness in like with Two Spirit folks, and also this like belief that all Indigenous folks use the word Two Spirit. And I think it's important to recognize that, like within here in New Mexico, like the Diné people do not use the word Two Spirit. It's a really problematic word amongst Diné people. So um, I want to just maybe talk about like how do we reconcile those two, and how do we like kind of expand on that loss of language.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, and a lot of folks think that anyone that's Indigenous and LGBTQ plus identifies as Two Spirit, and that's not the case. And I do really love and admire um, like the cultivation of that term, like 1990 Winnipeg LGBTQ First Nations conference, where they wanted to give a name for the folks. Like I mentioned, like stripping away of language is a genocidal act, and for genders and people who loved beyond the gender binary or lived beyond the gender binary, those terms were some of the first to go. So as Two Spirit was kind of created for this to be this like indigenous specific term, especially for people whose identities and those names had been forcibly erased. So some people choose to identify like if they still have that language, like you mentioned the Dene folks, like they still have Nidle and like other variations on that, which might be more accurate. But I do love that, you know, it seems like this decolonial turn of like recognizing like lesbian, trans, like these are white words, you know?
Yeah.
And like to have something by us for us, like the FUBU of genders and sexualities, you know?
The FUBU of gender and sex.
You're welcome.
Oh, that's great. I love it. Pico, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so usually when people create some sort of document where you have to put your gender, it's usually like trans, non-binary, two-spirit. But I think it's important for people to remember if you're creating those documents to just include an other option, because though those might be like the most accessible terms, it just won't fit with um, everyone's identity.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so like the terms like transvestite, transsexual started being really used in the late 19th century, psychopathia sexualis, um, which for as like great as people thought it was, like thinking about that now and reading it now in 2020 is like, oh my God, it's really kind of frightening. And for those who don't know, the psychopathia sexualis was I don't remember how many people they interviewed in like jails and in insane asylums, asking them about like their gender identity and their sexuality and stuff. And it was really, really traumatizing for a lot of folks. But we use that kind of right as the like beginning of understanding of sexuality and gender identity. And then we see like the first recorded gender affirmation surgery in the earliest 20th century. Um, so I wanted to ask, like, how do we include gender identity and expression in a non-colonial way, in a non-Western European way specifically, um, in our conversation around the history of trans folks? So something easy.
I think that if you're going to be engaging in that work, it's important to do surveys and incorporate data into the work that you are doing, to really see and like encompass all identities rather than just like the most popular ones. So I think doing like studies, but make sure that you have some sort of like subject position within the community, that you're not, I'm a Latinx person doing it on queer and trans Black people. No, I should probably stay within my realm and do it on my community to look at, the data of like how people are, expressing their gender, and stuff like that. So I think that especially we as like BIPOC with who are doing like queer and trans studies at universities, a lot of the LGBTQ work and data, and organizing has been done by, white LGBTQ people. So I think it's our time to kind of engage within our communities to, create that sort of new content and new literature, and new understandings of how gender works like within our communities.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with what Pika said, and like also for folks who are doing kind of like the trans history, like you were mentioning, Frankie, those roots, and like I think of like Magnus Hirschfeld in Berlin, who had that incredible library and pushed a lot of things. And one of the things he did, which was really rare for white anthropologists, was also like contextualizing it within a global context. And it's important to remember that like sex as a binary and gender as a binary were created at the same time as whiteness, and all of those projects are intertwined. And so when we're doing trans history, like we're also looking at the creation of whiteness. So like Magnus Hirschfeld, like it was right around the time of like the Hottentot Venuses, where they're just like, oh my gosh, in South Africa, these women, they're like a different species of human, and because their bodies are like this, they are all lesbians. And Magnus Hirschfeld was like, actually, like all bodies are the same regardless of race, and if you think there's X amount of lesbians in that society, then there's the same amount in Berlin. And just like Germans lost their goddamn minds at that thought. They're like, lesbians in Berlin, which like quite a few. But I think it's just really important when you're doing that work and unpacking that like the creation of the sex binary and the creation of the gender binary are works of white supremacy. And so when we do trans studies, we need to understand that like trans studies exists because of these things.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So we are actually live on Facebook also, and we do have somebody monitoring our Facebook page. So if you're watching this through Facebook and you have a question, please put it in the comment section and we will get that question to us. So I think that we've created kind of a good base for talking about the trans movement. So let's actually maybe talk about some like highlights of the trans movement within the US.
So we have it wasn't the first LGBTQ riot, but it was the first sort of non-organized political event in history that specifically focused on the disenfranchisement of trans people, especially working class trans people, in San Francisco. And that was the Compton Cafeteria riots, which happened in the Tenderloin District. And the Tenderloin District was a sector of San Francisco that was a haven for a lot of trans and queer people, because it was where a lot of them were allowed to do sex work, the only place that they were allowed to rent rooms in hotels. And so obviously that's where a lot of the trans community congregated. And there's organized crime. So that's pretty much why there was so much access to the trans community, and being able to function within a society. And so the Compton cafeteria riots, eventually, because that's where what people would call loiter, but really it was them building community. They would just order like one cup of coffee and then talk for hours, chisme, stuff like that. But eventually, um, businesses, they were losing money because of the amount of like people who were just staying there and just ordering small items on the menu. They called the police, and I believe a trans woman threw a hot cup of coffee on a cop, and that's what sparked the riots. And a lot of people tend to forget about the Compton cafeteria riots because of the Stonewall riots. The Stonewall riots is a really, really critical historical event that you know was then uh, formulated into present what we know now as like Pride. But Compton cafeteria riots was really important for the trans community because it was the majority of people who were fighting against police brutality, and within that district were trans, working class, sex workers, majority of them BIPOC.
And I think it's so great when we like think about Compton, right? A couple of years ago, we had Felicia Flames as as actually our keynote speaker for a TDOR celebration. Think about 5 years ago, and the language that was used, right? Like even thinking about that, like the word hair fairy, which is something that I don't know if we would really use that anymore, but I think it's such a great term. But we use things like hair fairy, sissy. Um, we did have like this notion of like butch and femme also, drag queens and transsexuals. Um, and I think that it's also important to show or demonstrate rather that one of the reasons why Compton isn't talked about as much is that there was a very deliberate erasure of newspaper reports of any kind of reporting about the Compton cafeteria riots. They blame it on a fire that happened in San Francisco, but there's other stories that survived, right? So this historical erasure, right, and this very deliberate governmental erasure of the Compton cafeteria riots, I think, is important for us to acknowledge as well. I also think it's important to also talk about like the importance of like trans and GNC folks within even like the Harlem Renaissance. Talking about like Gladys Bentley Raw and Ma Rainey had drag queens who were like her like backup dancers, and that we had like drag balls and stuff in the Harlem Renaissance, and it was also though connected, and you mentioned this earlier, Pico. It was connected to organized crime and to also corrupt police officers who would allow these things to happen as long as you were paying the money that you needed to pay. And that is one of the things that there's a lot of discussion, right, around Stonewall. Did the Stonewall riots happen just because they weren't paying the money they were supposed to?
Yeah, and if I could hop on the black drag train, the first written example of someone identifying as a drag queen was William Dorsey Swan, who was born into slavery in Maryland, and he would throw these drag balls in DC, and almost all of the attendants were folks who were formerly enslaved. And I love it, kind of this like double emancipation of like, we're no longer enslaved and now we can like live and dress as we please, and I'm gonna wear like the finest dresses I can. And like one of my favorite stories about this person, and I think is a great example of like mutual aid and how that has always existed in like BIPOC, queer, and trans spaces. Dorsey worked at a library and stole books and was teaching other people in the ball scene how to read and got arrested for it. Like Dorsey Swan got arrested all the time because like black drag queen 1800s. um, but the university that he worked at didn't want him charged for those crimes, so he got a presidential pardon from Grover Cleveland for teaching other drag queens how to read, which I just love so much. Like this badass tall drag queen like teaching the community and like getting a presidential pardon. But I know there's a movie coming out soon about that life story. Because I think people think that like drag began and ended with RuPaul, and it's like, no, 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 honey. Like this goes back to the 19th century.
I I really appreciate that comment, right? Um the idea that like trans or like trans and like drag queens are like this very new thing. And like I think even when we look at like Pose, right? Like Pose um is like a really good example of like the ways that we like it seems like this invention, right, of like the like ball culture and like not acknowledging that ball culture is a direct response to racism. Crystal LaBeija um, was, and there's a really famous documentary. It's out on Netflix now. It was not available for like years and years, and now it's finally available. It's called The Queen, and it is about a drag slash trans pageant in New Jersey, I want to say. And like Andy Warhol was one of the judges. And Crystal LaBeija felt like she should have won. And she was like fifth alternate or something, or fourth alternate. Um, and she was just like, no, like you guys are not, you let someone win who wasn't as polished as I am. And so I'm going to create my own movement. I'm going to create my own space. And so that is how like we formulated this like ball culture that we have now. And like the LaBeija family was like the House of LaBeija was one of the biggest families that started like that movement. um I also wanted to just talk a little bit about Lucy Hicks Anderson, specifically because there is like a New Mexico connection with her, and she like lived in Silver City and like ran a brothel in Silver City, and was a Black trans woman who um, was it was a really amazing space, right? Because she always acknowledged that she was a woman. She just said, I am a woman, and like never really talked about her like body parts, right? And never talked about like her anatomy. She was just like, I am a woman. And she was later charged with fraud because she was collecting her husband's um, pension from the army after he had passed away. And so I think it's important just to acknowledge those because there is history before Stonewall and Compton, and it's just been so widely erased and whitewashed, really. When the that atrocity that was premiered a couple of years ago of Stonewall, right? And like it was like this, like it had this like white boy from the Midwest, blonde hair, blue eyed, as like the hero of Stonewall. And like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were like just kind of like smashed together into this like ethnically ambiguous, maybe trans kind of sometimes person, androgynous as well. And you know, luckily though, it was met with a lot of opposition. And there was a lot of people who were like, oh, y'all messed up on this one, which I think is great, right? But there's not a lot of that representation. There's the documentary Disclosure on Netflix, which we are actually going to don't watch it yet because we're going to have a discussion about it next semester. But I think it's important when we talk about the trans movement and trans liberation. Like, I think that part of the problem is that there's just been no really big conversation about trans identities. And so, if you are a trans person in the 1930s living in, Kansas, where do you have that sense of self, and how do you create that sense of self? And so that's why I think it's important for us to talk about these historical figures and to talk about like the fact that there is a history of us, and there is a a legacy of transness and queerness in the United States that I think is so often ignored.
Yeah, and just like quickly to continue to throw shit at Stonewall, it was a white gay boy from Indiana, and as a Hoosier, no, no. But the official monument commemorating Stonewall in New York City is a bronze statue created by a white, straight, cis man. And the four figures are white, cis, straight people, none of whom were at Stonewall. And it's a bronze statue that was like literally whitewashed. And I was like, oh, mwah, chef's kiss. Thank you for like making this argument so clear that you literally whitewashed the history of Stonewall. And like there have been a few incidents throughout the last few years of people like dressing them up like Marsha and Sylvia and like um kind of like defacing them for good, I guess. But just it's really interesting the way that it got whitewashed and how trans people were completely excluded for the furtherment of the gay rights movement, right? Like there's the Mattachine Society, which was like the homophile society of like respectable white gays who wanted assimilation, wrote a plea on the walls, and they're like, "We, the homosexuals of the village, beg you to please behave yourselves." And it's like, I want to swear, but I won't. But like, go away, go away, let us live. And like the way that things quickly turned, and in the 70s like Sylvia Rivera not being allowed to speak at Pride, like one of the women who started Stonewall, who did so much for the community with Star and like housing and feeding trans kids, like white gays were like, no, 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 like we need to come, like this is a one-dimensional issue, like this is just about gay rights, like we want to get married and we want to assimilate, and like you brown trans people do not fit into this narrative.
So you mentioned it earlier. You mentioned STAR, which is the street trans. Well, it was transsexual at the time. They did eventually evolve into using transgender action revolutionaries. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, and I just use the term one dimensional, and there's a great book, The One Dimensional Queer by Roderick Ferguson, who's a black queer scholar that's incredible and focuses a lot on STAR and the amazing movement that they, or all the work that they did, but they had something called the Star House, and it was for especially trans kids, but also queer kids who were kicked out of their houses where they could sleep and live. And Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson would hustle so that the kids didn't have to. And it was just like a safe landing place for these kids when like there were no government services for them at all. And so you can, one of the first times they actually marched to was for the Young Lords, which was a Puerto Rican radical organization in New York City. So it's important to note too that Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were also really committed to, these radical liberation movements, these anti-war movements, these pro-black, these pro-Latinx movements, and like grassroots all the way. So Star was like just this really radical model of mutual aid and caring for community that doesn't get talked about enough.
Yeah, I think that we invisibilize those parts that aren't respectable, right? And this notion of like we need to talk about history of LGBTQ folks through this like frame of like respectability politics. And I often like to ask the question like, what do you think Sylvia and Marsha would think of Pride today? And I think that we know the answer to that, right? And it's words that we can't say live. Because my boss is here and I want to cuss in front of doctors, right? I'm kidding. But right, like we need to acknowledge that the way that these movements have evolved are not necessarily reflective of where they were. And also even acknowledging, right, that like Stonewall was just not this like night of like radical action. It was a multi-day riot. And it was also like a lot of like, it was rooted really in police brutality. And it was folks like it was folks who were part of like the Black Panthers, and it was other like groups and organizations that were coming and rioting as well and were marching alongside our trans and queer elders who are still here and passed on. And also I think it's important to honor the fact that there was a butch woman, um, potentially gender nonconforming, that again is highly contested, but Stormé de la Barrie was there and was also like really important to this, and we've like invisibilized, right, like our butch women in that. And so do you guys have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so um with Stormé, I'm just going to use they for now because like Frankie said, um when the police raided Stonewall, they were the first person within the bar to face police brutality. So they got, I believe, either punched in the face or the stomach, and they turned to everybody and they said, "Are you going to do anything about this?" And that's actually what sparked the riots. And it's not taking away, you know, the glory of Marsha and Sylvia, because it was never about the glory for them, you know. But um, I think we do, like Frankie said, uh, turn away from a lot of history when it comes to femme, BIPOC, butch people. Um, and you know, a lot of people still think that Stonewall riots was because of a brick or a shot glass thrown at a mirror, but it was because of a black, butch, or gender nonconforming femme person.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that for so long, this like idea of Stonewall as this like moment of like liberation and everyone, and there was also this like huge um idea of, it was really perpetuated for many, many years, that the reason Stonewall happened is because of the death of Judy Garland. Because Judy Garland had died a few days before the funeral. Her funeral was a few days before the Stonewall riots, and it was this myth that was perpetuated. Even still, I think it is still a very big myth amongst folks. So I I just want to acknowledge that it wasn't just a single issue, and it really wasn't, and it was in response to the 3 article law, which I don't know if either one of you want to talk more about and expand on that.
Yeah, it's like the 3 article law being, and it existed on the books in most states, that you had to wear 3 articles of clothing that reflected the sex you were assigned at birth. That's me translating it to use nicer terms for trans people today. So, like, if you were a drag queen, like, you'd have to have, like, 3 items of clothing that would be considered quote unquote men's clothing. Um, and just like to echo what y'all were saying too about like there is so much debate around like who started the Stonewall riots, and that takes away from the fact like it was this incredible coalition of folks, and it was a battle against police brutality and the way that it impacted trans and queer folks, especially BIPOC folks. And when we like try to nitpick of like, oh no, like it was this person, it was this person, it was this person, it kind of draws away from that history. And there's also an incredible episode of Nancy, a queer podcast, where they interview Stormy towards the end of their life. It's just like really touching because they were a bouncer at gay bars up until their 80s. Like, it's like they never left the scene, and they're definitely like an invisibilized piece of queer and trans history that I wish more people would see and witness.
Yeah, yeah. I just want to acknowledge real quick, one of our panelists for tomorrow, Maddie Jim, actually posted something. Native, Indigenous, trans existence um, existed before and after colonization. Also, even though there were no definitions, I didn't come out as trans first. I said I was gay into the late '90s, and I hear the word transgender. And happy you're doing this for Awareness Week. Maddie Jim is an amazing source of information. I'm super excited that she's a panelist tomorrow. So just also like a plug about tomorrow. We were talking about existing as trans in 2020. We're going to have an amazing intergenerational panel, so I hope you attend. I hope you join us as well. Also, Celia, the one who works for Empower and is also Miss New Mexico Pride 2015. And oh no, not 2015. Oh my God, I'm sorry. Celia's gonna fight me. 2019. Thank you for this. This is great information I didn't know about. And I think that, yeah, like we need to have these conversations because there's so many folks who don't have this history, and there's so many folks who have had these amazing pieces of knowledge that we've lost that history because they have passed on. And I think that, it's important to also still acknowledge that Miss Major is still around and kicking ass. And, there's this picture of her from this summer in her like hover round at like a BLM protest in Little Rock, Arkansas. And, I think that one of the things that, as somebody who is more mature than you all, I think it's important to, to share this information because we shouldn't be doing this stuff in our 60s and 70s. Like when I'm 60, I want to like sit down. I want to, I want to have somebody who is leading these conversations and these discussions and these actions really. And so I want to move us a little forward beyond Stonewall and talking about like trans visibility in like the 70s, and like talking about like Sylvester in particular, who is somebody who is read as trans, but again, like that is it's a very blurred conversation. And Sylvester was a disco queen, and my favorite song, and I used to perform this song all the time in like my early drag career with this like really hideous jumpsuit that I no longer wear. Because I looked at it, I was like, oh girl. Although I love a jumpsuit. I do love a jumpsuit. But the song Do You Wanna Funk? And such a good song, but also like, Sylvester, it was this representation of like a very like gender non-conforming presentation of artistry that I just love so much. And even, I think when we talk about the 70s, like there is this like idea of like gender fluidity when we think about like people like Grace Jones, who was a bit more 80s, a little bit late 70s, early 80s, and also like Bowie, right? And like I think that Bowie was allowed to do so, given that Bowie was a white person. So anyone want to add to the 70s conversation? No?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think it's important to note, like, while we had all of these, like, kind of like, I feel like the term gender bending was used a lot for them back in the day. Artists, this was also at the time where a lot of trans organizations were just starting to get their legs, and this was also when a lot of university based, they were called like gender dysphoria clinics at the time, were getting started up. So, like, while we had these artists who were able to be more gender fluid, these places that were offering transition services really forced people to choose, like, there are two genders, there are two sexes, like you have to do X, Y, and Z, and it was like the deep medicalization of trans identity. Um, and I want to bring up Lou Sullivan because we haven't talked a lot about any like trans men in history, but Lou Sullivan founded like the first organization for female to male trans folks, and he also identified as a gay man, and he was denied access to medical transition because one of the requirements was that you couldn't be queer and trans, like that wasn't a thing they allowed. And now I'm just like, I don't know if I know any straight trans people. And so just like, right, Frankie?
I can, yeah.
But yeah, like, so it's interesting that like while these cultural icons were allowed to be fluid, folks who were out and proud as trans had to fill out all of these boxes and like fit a very rigid gender identity and gender expression. But yeah, just wanted to uplift Lou, and his diaries just got published, which I'm really excited. I just ordered a copy of that. I think it's called We Both Laughed in Pleasure, but just some like kind of rare trans masc history. Because often before him, trans masculine people, it's pretty easy for us once we start testosterone to just kind of like blend into heteronormative society. And he really wanted to, create a network. And he had like a newsletter that he sent all over the world, and like was one of the first really visible trans masc people. Yes, and also shout out to Adrian Lawyer and Zane, who founded the Transgender Resource Center here in
No,
New
I
York.
think there are only two like straight trans
Oh.
men I know. Yeah, it took me. I had to like go through my like Rolodex, right, of like
The trans
trans
Rolodex.
men that I know. Um, yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that one of the things that we do is we do like really focus our conversation on trans women, and rightfully so, because trans women are at the highest risk of experiencing violence in all forms. Um, in physical and emotional, sexual, financial as well. And I don't think we ever think about like financial violence enough. We never talk about financial violence enough. And, as for those of us who have like worked and have been grossly underpaid, like it is a form of violence. So we're going to move on to the 80s and, oh, Pico.
Oh, just one more cultural icon in the Latinx community, Walter Mercado. I believe his show started in the 1970s. Um, and though, he didn't identify as any gender or any sexuality, um, I think that specifically for the Latinx community, it was a sort of representation for a gender expression that a lot of, because we are colonized people, that though back then, pre-colonization, we had multiple genders, but now we're confined to like this dichotomy of like male and female norms. Um, Walter Mercado was this kind of breakthrough, and I feel like maybe Frankie for you um, was a really like big influence in how to like express gender in a non heteronormative and confined way.
Yeah, no, I grew up watching Walter Mercado. And I mean, I also grew up in a very like unique household where like I didn't feel punished ever for being like la más fresita, like as like, sissy as I was, because like girl, I was like my mom bought me like She-Ra toys because I had like He-Man. I was like, I want She-Ra too. And so like I had like the She-Ra dolls. And I had the horse that smelled like apple. For those of you she had a horse that smelled like apple. It was clear. It was amazing. Like, oh my God, it was such a cool toy. But seeing people like Walter Mercado, like it was this gender variant person who was in so many households and was such a like accepted person in a household. And I think though that like Walter Mercado was, accepted, right? And there wasn't this big push because of this like relationship to spirituality and this relationship to like being like very gender like variant was like allowed because of this context. And that kind of brings us a little bit into the 80s a little bit more, and the devastation of the trans community because of AIDS. And I think that one of the things that Pose has done a good job of is how prevalent like AIDS was. And I think that it's something that a lot of like young folks, like I would argue like anybody under the age of 30 like doesn't really understand that like fear that folks lived in. We went out and like we went hard every weekend because it might be our last weekend. And I think that that's really like where we started using the term like family and stuff, because it was our community and it was family that we weren't sure that we were going to see again. And so it's such a like interesting point, and it's interesting for me, like as somebody who's 38 years old, going to be 39 in a little bit, in like a month and a half or something. I don't know. I can't tell time. But I am seen as like an elder almost in the gay community, right? The LGBTQ community, because we lost this whole generation of individuals. And so I do want to spend a little time talking about the 80s and the trans movement and the declassification of homosexuality, because while the word homosexuality was taken out of the DSM for in 1973, the classification of homosexuality was actually removed until the mid 80s. And it's important for us to distinguish the two.
So during the 80s, there was an organization called ACT UP.
Mhm.
And I think ACT UP was one of the very few intersectional AIDS organization that created a movement that encompassed BIPOC people and trans people, because Marsha P. Johnson was actually a member of ACT UP. Because in the 80s, ads um, and a lot of the resources that were being provided for people in the community who, were diagnosed with AIDS, it was targeted towards cis white men who had money.
Mhm.
The advertisements, the posters on the flyers on the streets, it was cis white males. And, the medication was expensive. Um, but I think it's also important to remember um, the community work and the mutual aid that was happening within the BIPOC community, um, who were, day and night working and struggling to provide resources for the community because they knew that it wasn't being provided by government entities.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Someone who came out as like who has been a prominent figure, I think, and people don't really like kind of. I mean, we talk about her a little bit, but Amanda Lepore, who is somebody who was a club kid in the '80s and is still around, and she's this amazing performer, and people. She is kind of an example of that mutual aid, right? Like she is very much like this, like glamazon, beautiful, like caricature almost of like Marilyn Monroe, which is very deliberate on her end. But also like it's very well known for like putting on shows and like doing, whatever she could to make sure that people did get money for their AIDS medication, to make sure that people were getting even funerals, right? Like it's important for us to talk about that idea that like people weren't allowed even funerals. Um, so it's important to have that conversation. We have 2 minutes left, and I feel like we would be doing injustice if we did not end on talking about maybe a little bit more current history with the person who is on your picture, Pico. So Jenny Set Gutierrez is a trans undocumented woman who was kicked out of the White House by President Obama, Barack Obama. At a gay pride celebration, and was told by individuals at the event, this is not about you. This isn't for you. And so that circles us back, right, to that invisibilization. I don't know if that's a word now, but it is. It works, of trans people in our history. And that is why it's important for us to constantly have these conversations, because if it wasn't for trans women, we wouldn't be here. We are standing on the shoulders of trans women. And if we are standing on them, that means that they are not breathing. We have to uplift them at all moments. So we have 1 minute. Any final comments? Why are y'all so quiet today? At the center, I can't ever get you guys to like be quiet. So I'm kidding.
I guess some last comments is that though we may think we're in a better place, there's a lot of historical events in the past that reflect what's happening now, and that we just need to continue to work and put in the work for the trans community, um, because the trans community deserves it.
Yeah.
And the trans community shouldn't just be celebrated when they're dying at an extremely high rate.
Mhm.
They should be celebrated at all times.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I just want to say too, like going back to genocide and like what happened to her. Like I think we have this notion in LGBTQ organizing of like trickle down liberation, like, well, the white gays will get theirs first, and like black trans people and undocumented trans people, you just gotta wait your turn, and wait your turn does not work. And one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors-Kahn, talks about bubble up liberation. And when we start with the most vulnerable, everyone benefits. When black trans women do better, we all do better. The life expectancy for BIPOC trans women is 35 years old, which is terrifying. And we need to do better. And when we do better by our BIPOC trans community, it's not like we're taking pie away from everybody else. Like, liberation isn't slices of pie. Like, we all do better, and we all do better. And when we center the needs of the most vulnerable, that's when we're going to be the most effective in our organizing.
Yeah. And I think that's a powerful way to end. Thank you both so much. I do want to give a shout out to two other events that we are having this week. Tomorrow at 5, we are having a panel on living as trans in 2020. It's an intergenerational panel. I'm super excited about it. And then on Friday, we have the Transgender Day Remembrance vigil that we will be hosting online. We have some amazing performers and speakers. I hope you join us. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you all later on. Have a good day.